In this video, I want to talk about creating light by glazing and reintroducing lights and glazing them over again and again. It's based on a video that I created for creating surface. And this is the painting that I got to in my demo. And I'm starting from that and just showing you some steps that I took along the way to create this sense of luminosity and depth in a kind of a pond scene with water lilies in the foreground and then light pouring in from the corner. This is phthalo blue that I'm rubbing on the surface, and I have added titanium white in places to kind of reintroduce layers of light. So now I'm adding some pastel, just mark making, some interesting bright mark making to create a little bit more surface interest and texture. You'll see as I work through this that I'm often working in horizontal lines because water is a series of flat planes. And everything growing out of the water is growing out of those planes, and floating on the water are floating on those planes as well. This is green gold that I'm glazing with now over some of those lights that I created by adding white again. And glazing right over the oil pastels as well. So I'll be going through a whole series of glazing and reintroducing lights and lifting as I am here with transparent colors like phthalos and green gold and inks. This is an umber ink, acrylic ink, that I'm just dropping into the background, and inks are very, very transparent. I've just added a little water there and I'm rubbing the ink in. They're very intense and very transparent. Phthalo blue is one of my go-to colors for doing these water paintings because it's really so very intense and so transparent. And it's just great for building up on top of other layers of paint. These are fluid formulas mainly I'm using, fluid acrylics. And I'm just laying it down on what I've got there, and again, kind of working in a horizontal way to capture the sense of the planes of the water, and rubbing to soften the lines and blend the color in. So I lift a little while I'm rubbing, but it still is lying there like a very thin layer. So I've reintroduced some titanium white here, and I'm going to show you another way I do this. The first bits I applied directly to the painting. Now I've applied to wax paper, and I just flip it over and apply it from the wax paper, and it creates really beautiful kind of distressed edges, the sort of thing it's hard to get when you apply it directly with a brush or even with a palette knife. And putting in the pond grasses with a thin rigger brush, and reintroducing a little bit of light and the floating lily pads. Again, titanium white, which is our most opaque white. So I often will recreate light over and over again by putting down titanium white and glazing, and then reintroducing titanium white again. This is cobalt blue, which is it's a heavy body paint, but I've thinned it out with water so it acts like a glazing color. And cobalt blue is great. It's neither very cool nor very hot, and it just kind of sits in a nice way on the surface. This is another transparent fluid formula, transparent red oxide, just to give it a little bit of warmth in the foreground. Although I kind of think as I go, and I felt that was a little bit harsh, so I lifted a little bit of that up. Again, adding some more pastel, oil pastel. And I really felt like I'd lost too much light in the lily pad, so I'm just When you feel like you've lost too much light, just throw some more titanium on there. You can always glaze it back again. And in between here, I've dried this very thoroughly with the blow dryer, because especially with titanium white, you want it to be super dry before you put anything else on top of it, or it'll just smudge and pull across your painting. This is an ochre ink. I really like this ochre. Again, just to create a little bit of warmth. So I've re-added the white, but I'm glazing over it again, just to kind of tone it down. And cadmium yellow, heavy body. So, you know, it's just a matter of building one layer on top of another. Back to my phthalo blue here. Now it's sitting in places on top of 2 or 3 other glazes. Cadmium yellow, ochre. So we're building lots and lots and lots of layers of thin paint to create this final sense of luminosity. And they're great. This is a great technique for water painting, because water is so transparent, and we don't want to lose the sense of transparency. This is Indian yellow, one of my favorite ink colors. So this is going to be really quite warm. I'm going to rub it in. That the white that I introduced in that quarter was looking a little bit harsh. So I just needed to tone it down a bit. And again, adding some more umber again to create this sense of kind of shadow in the background. And again, rubbing it in. Because light is soft, it doesn't have hard edges, so we really want to rub those glazes in. And you can add a little bit with brushwork as well. This is a quinacridone gold I'm adding here, another one of my very favorite glazing colors. It's a fluid formula again. And sort of pulling those places that are closest to us towards us by adding that warm glaze. And I'm adding a little bit more light here with the brush, smoothing it out. This environment was where there was vegetation all around the pond, really split the light up and made it very dappled. So there are almost like pieces of light falling on the surface of the pond. So these water paintings, there's all these different layers. What's under the pond, what's emerging from it, like these grasses that I'm drawing, the things that fall on the surface of the pond or sit on the surface of the pond, like the lily pads. So there's all these great layers to play with when you're doing water paintings. And of course I've reintroduced this vegetation in bright white titanium again, so we have to knock it back. The bright white will just sit on the surface of the painting, so it's necessary to glaze it. I thought I'd lost some light here on the surface. I was losing the sense of the plane of the surface, so I re-added some white and then lifted it to just make it a little less harsh. I glazed it with blue again. That's a step that's missing from the video. And now I've got some dioxazine purple because we need some real darks in here now. So dioxazine purple, heavy body. And I mixed it actually with a little bit of burnt sienna just to make it a little less harshly purple. And this is where we're getting our real darks in. And all of a sudden the lights really push forward, really come out when we push our darkest darks up against our lightest lights, that's when we start to get some real drama. So this painting is on a piece of watercolor paper that has been gessoed. It's got a little bit of texture, the surface, but it's got a lot of layers of paint on, and the more paint you get on it, the more the texture kind of disappears under all these layers. And plus the gesso also smoothed out the texture of the watercolor paper. So it makes a really tough surface to work on. So again, here's my phthalo blue, just putting it on with a brush and my fingers. I always like to get my fingers in. Just it creates that kind of soft edge that we want sometimes. And I'm just using a brayer here and then reinforcing that sense of horizontal surface. And finally adding a few more glimmers of light on the surface with a palette knife and titanium white, adding a few more glazes here and there to kind of adjust the layers so that there's nothing really starkly white in the background that's going to pop forward. Adding some more pastel, and the pastel can be fixed with a pastel fixative. If I, for instance, wanted to frame this and preserve it. So that is the kind of process that I use to create water paintings.